In this lecture, we are going to learn about NgRx Meta-Reducers. So we will learn what is a meta-reducer, when do we use it, and how do we use it. In NgRx, a meta-reducer is a higher order function. That means a meta-reducer is a function which takes a reducer as an argument and then it also returns a new reducer. So you can think of a meta-reducer like a middleware that sits in between the dispatched action and your regular reducers. So far we have learned that whenever we dispatch an action, after the action is dispatched, a reducer comes into picture and it changes the state. Now let's say what we want is, once an action is dispatched and before the reducer function changes the state, before that we want to execute some logic. We can do that with the help of meta-reducers. So meta-reducers are executed before the actual reducer functions which changes the state. So meta-reducers, they act as a hook in action, meta-reducer and reducer. So once an action is dispatched and before the reducer changes the state, the meta-reducer comes into picture and it executes some logic. So the meta-reducers allows us to intercept actions and the current state before they reach the primary reducers. And this enables us to execute any logic or modify the state in the ways that aren't specific to a single features reducer. Let's try to understand meta-reducer with an example. But before that, here I am in our NgRx application, and here what is happening is I am already logged in, but when I try to go to courses page, I'm not able to navigate to courses page. And if I open developer console, you will see that in the console we have an error. And what does this error says? It says that action types are registered more than once. So basically this action type, it has been registered more than once. And in the last lecture, what we have done is, if I go to AppModule, there we have added this runtime check, strict action type uniqueness. So this runtime check, what it does is, it checks if all the actions have a unique value. But if I go to our courses state, and there if I go to courses actions.ts, in there you will see that for this delete course action and this delete course success action, I have specified the same type. So here the type is same, it is not unique. And since it is not unique, this runtime check is throwing an error. So now we are going to fix it. So here I'll say the type is delete course success. Let's save the changes. All right, now let's go ahead and let's create a meta reducer. So for that, let's go to store, and here we have this app state. In here, I'm going to create a reducer. So here what I'm going to do is, I'm going to create a function. Remember that a meta reducer is nothing but a function, and it is a higher order function. A higher order function is that function which can take another function as an argument or which can return a function. So here, let's go ahead and let's create and export a function. I'm going to call this function as logger. You can call this function anything. Okay. And this function, since we are creating a meta reducer function, this function is going to take a reducer function as an argument, and it is also going to return a reducer function. So here, let's specify a parameter. Let's call it reducer, and this is going to be of type action reducer. And to use it, we also need to import it from NgRx too. And for now, here, let's specify the type as any. Okay. And from within this function also, we need to return a reducer. So here, I'm going to return a reducer function. So let's create a function using arrow function syntax. And this reducer function is going to receive a state and the action. So let's simply call it as action. Now here, the return type for this function is going to be action reducer, because as we learned, this function is also going to return a reducer, right? Now here, this function which we are creating, this function is going to receive the current state and it is going to receive the action which has been dispatched. So what I simply want to do here is, inside this reducer function is not going to change any state. Instead, for each action which gets dispatched, we want to log the previous state before that action was dispatched and also the action name. So here I can simply say console.log. Here I want to log the state. So here first I'll say state, okay, or I'll say state before, and then we want to log the state, and I also want to log the action which has been dispatched. So console.log, I'll say action, and here I want to log the action which has been dispatched. All right, so remember that this state which we are logging here, it is the state before the action is dispatched. And this action is the action name which has been dispatched. And remember that since we are creating a meta-reducer function, this meta-reducer function will be called every time a new action is dispatched. Okay, so every time a new action is dispatched in our Angular application, this meta-reducer will be called. Now from here, we also need to return a reducer. So here I'm going to say return, and here we have this reducer function which we are receiving as an argument. So we are going to call that reducer. Okay, so we are simply going to call that reducer, and to that we are going to pass the initial state and the action. Okay, and here we also need to specify any. Okay, so basically this meta-reducer function, this will be called for each action which gets dispatched. And when an action will be dispatched, this meta-reducer function is going to receive the current state and the action which has been dispatched. And after executing these logics, we are calling the reducer related to that particular action. So for example, if let's say increment button is clicked in the counter page, that means the increment action has been dispatched. So when the increment action is dispatched, first this meta reducer will be executed, and then it is going to call the reducer function which is responsible for handling increment action. I hope you got the point. And with this, the implementation of our logger meta reducer function is complete. Here, I'm writing a very simple logic to log the previous state and the dispatched action in the console. But here, you can also write any complex logic which you want to execute before the reducer function gets executed. Now, this is not it. What we also need to do is, let's go ahead and let's export a new variable, and let's call it meta reducers. Okay, and here this meta reducers, it is going to be of type meta reducer, and it is going to be an array of meta reducer. So here let's also specify the type as app state, because we want to run this meta reducer for the entire application. So any action which has been dispatched in our application, for that we want to run this meta reducer. So this is not feature specific. So for example, I don't want to execute this meta reducer only for course module or for the counter module. I want to execute this meta reducer for any action which gets dispatched in our application. And to this we need to assign an array, and in that array we are going to add our logger reducer. So this is our meta reducer. Now here, when I'm adding it like this, remember that this will be executed in all cases. So it is possible that we are only interested in logging the state and the action when we are in the development mode. In the production mode, we might not want to run this logger meta reducer. So for that, what we can do is, let me remove it from here. And in the next line, we will say, if not environments dot mode, if it is not production. So instead of writing not here, I'll say if it is not equal to production, then I want to add this logger to the meta reducer array. Otherwise, I want to return empty array. So now this logger meta reducer will run only when we are in the mode. So you can also write it like this, but here I want to keep things simple. So I'll comment this and I'll write it here, and I'm simply going to assign an array here where I will add this logger meta-reducer. And finally, let's go to AppModule.ts file, and there we are going to register our meta-reducer. So in this options object which we are passing here, there we have added one option which is runtime checks. There we are also going to add the meta-reducer which we have created. So first we are going to import it and we are going to add it here. Okay, so here I can see we have an error and it says no value exists in the scope for meta-reducer. Let's scroll up and let's see if meta-reducer is being imported or not. So here we have imported app.reducer. In the same way, I also want to import meta-reducers. All right, with this, the error is gone and meta-reducer has been added here. Let's save the changes. And now let's go to our application. And first of all, let me try to go to the courses page. So now the courses page is loading. And if I open developer console, you will see that each action and the state before that has been logged here. So state before this action, this NgRx store init, before that the state was undefined. Okay, then the next action which has been dispatched is NgRx effect init. So state before that is this. So you can see all the actions and the previous state of that action has been logged here. If let's say go to counter, then more actions will be dispatched. So the state before that action and the action object itself has been logged. Okay, so basically this meta reducer function, this is getting executed before the reducer function related to the dispatched action is called. And this is the use of meta reducer. Now, in this way, you can have multiple meta reducers and you can add all those meta reducers to this array. And remember that the order in which you add those meta reducers, they will be executed in that same order. Okay, so we can have multiple meta reducers and we can add them in this array, in this meta reducer array, and they will be executed in the order in which they have been added in this array. All right, so this is all I wanted to cover in this lecture. For now, I'm simply going to remove this logger from here because I don't want to execute this logger meta reducer for each action. So I have just removed it from there. But I hope now you understand how you can create a meta reducer and add it to this meta reducer array. If you have any questions from this lecture, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.